Thank you for the introduction. Well, we're from ITU, and in this presentation, we will kind of channel Espen a tiny bit with his plea for more ontology. So originally, we were working on a paper for a different conference where we tried to make sense of procedural or semiotic meaning of objects. And we were working with health packs, and we started wondering, is it possible to typologize them? So in our presentation, we will show you how it kind of wasn't, but also how we try to deal with that problem. So first off, we decided to work with health packs. They turned out not to be as simple as we thought, because we are talking about in-game objects, which we can identify as health packs. But to scope even more, we're talking about digital games in virtual environments with a health system that the health pack relates to that can be influenced through objects which we identify as health packs. So that is the scoping, already kind of signifying that this is not as simple as it may look.
Exactly. Because we got ourselves in a lot of trouble, although we wanted to keep it simple. So we ended up talking about games more or less in general, or at least about games in virtual environments. Why are health packs so interesting to us? The main observation is that in very few games where we encounter health packs, they are completely neutral, if you will, iconic signifiers. If you think of Quake 3 Arena or nowadays Quake Live, you have these floating bubbles which have a plus sign that basically just denotes, or more even connotes, a tradition of basically identifying the Red Cross with healing and health. That is exceedingly rare, come to think about it, because even in a game as classic as Doom, you have these little tiny white boxes which are referential, right? So there you have that red cross on white ground, and it references to a more specific degree a tradition of healing and a tradition of pharmacological discourses, if you will. This becomes even more evident when you think of even more complex games like Fallout 3, and we have had so much Fallout 3 here. Probably a lot of you will remember the controversy when the game was about to launch about the morphine syringe, right? In the original version of the game submitted to the Australian rating board, there was an in-game object called morphine. It was a morphine syringe. And the Australians objected heavily to that portrayal of real-world drugs in a game. So the object remained in the game, was renamed MedX, and still retained its qualities on the level of gameplay, on the purely mechanical level of being addictive. So it is an addictive substance that is implemented in the gameplay as something that not actually heals you, but gives additional damage resistance. So we have here a healing system where healing objects, like the traditional stim pack in the Fallout series, and highly controversial elements like morphine coexist, and where we have something that is on the signification level by its naming of morphine or MedX, evoking different contexts and different associations, as well as being on the level of gameplay, more or less controversial. So with this example, I think it would be very easy to make, and that's what we're going to basically do at SEEKS next week, an argument that this is a classical case of the pharmacon, right? It is that object that can be a remedy and can be poison, depending on if you use it properly or misuse it. So that was the one problem that we faced. The other problem that we discovered is that health packs always come with baggage, if you will. They always have their families and friends. Think of a simple health model as that in Half-Life. In Half-Life, Half-Life 2 in this case, we all remember these health packs littered around the game world. But in Half-Life, we also have these health stations. So we have healing that works in the very same mechanical fashion that is powered either by these pickup objects or by static entities in the game world. To make matters worse, we also have a shield system in Half-Life, right? So, and this shield system is again powered by pickup objects, little batteries, and dispensers of energy in the game world. So that is something, a trend that we could then identify in very many games. And it usually seemed to us that we have the health pack as an object in the game world that we can only make sense of by actually accounting for the ecology in which it is embedded, both on the level of gameplay and of signification. So what that then led us to was basically to completely freak out, because what do we have to consider with those games? In the end, basically almost everything. And then we accepted that challenge and thought, okay, if the health pack as an object appears in so many games, is intrinsically so complex and so linked to different aspects of a game, then it may actually be a class of object that might help us understand how games work. And that here, basically, we should probably have that footnote that when we first started thinking about objects and their properties and their affordances, and we're going to talk about that much more, we went to the Game Ontology project from 10 years ago, which has this wonderful, notable omission where they say, okay, we would love to talk about in-game objects, but we actually can't. That is so complex, we're just going to talk about object manipulation, and we leave the objects for later points. So that was basically when we realized we were probably onto something. So what we then tried out was to actually categorize health packs in a traditional taxonomy, break down what we find. Again, just problematization. I'm just going to throw out problems and Ea's going to solve them. So what we found is that health systems often hybridize with other paradigms of life and death. For example, in a classic like Wolfenstein 3D, we have health packs already in the same form and shape as they appeared then a year later in Doom, but we still have multiple lives here. So these two paradigms coexist in that early shooter. And to basically, go from that very old school model to one that has been established in the last 10 years or so, many modern shooters have done away with health pickups, but have implemented auto-healing systems, often also doing away with actual discrete health counters. Now, all these systems hybridize and appear in new modified versions. If you think of what Bioshock does, for example. It has a health system. You pick up health objects, you replenish health by that way, but it has also a form of respawn through the Vita chambers, which we would contest is not the same as having multiple lives, because it is more or less an infinite respawn that can be activated in the game world. So it has, again, a different function. So lumping those two, basically the model of Wolfenstein 3D and Bioshock, would bracket out a lot of potential for interpretation. The same is true if you think about how auto-heal has now been merged with other forms of healing paradigms. In the recent Wolfenstein The New Order, you have a numerical discrete health counter on a continuous scale from 1 to 100 or even over 100. But there is an auto-heal function implemented that always will heal you up to the next 20%. Which is something that we just, realized through gameplay. It's not really documented. And it doesn't make that much sense, because here we have a function that other games before had implemented not in a numerical counter, but in blocks or segmented health counters. So the way that health is represented on the screen, again, seems to be very, very acutely important. And then the next problem, of course, is when we think about how health then, as a holistic system, hybridizes, or not hybridizes, but interacts with other systems of gameplay. For example, inventory management, be it weight and size of objects, of health objects, the monetary economy that you can trade healing objects for money, what kind of value is attributed to them. But not only those more or less standards of RPG interaction between different game systems are interesting, but of course when we talk about the signification of healing objects in games, something like Fable, where you have a healing object, a lot of food has healing capabilities, and one of those food items is tofu. Tofu in that game system gives you positive health and positive karma. So you become a better person by eating tofu, right? Just in the same way, if you will, as eating food in the Fallout world gives you positive radiation, which is of course a negative effect. So all these interrelations that we identified led us basically to something like this. We came up with a big, big table in which we more or less ended up with every single interesting case we encountered being its own category, and it basically exploded. And when we had 15 variables and 20 types, after basically just examining that many examples, we gave up on that model and moved to something quite different and synthetic.
Yes, we believe that we could find a different way of making meaning of health packs in games. But in order to understand the synthetic typology that I'll present in a second, I'd like to introduce our three-dimensional module of object understanding. So we built this for health packs. It may be applicable in other cases. It consists, first off, of properties that Tracy Fullerton in Game Design Workshop defines as the qualities or attributes that define physical or conceptual aspects of objects. Generally, these are a set of values that describe an object. That means that this definition of properties let us explore objects in relation to the game system, their complexity, but also their relation to other objects in the game world. The coded object is defined by the properties. It is a non-actualized object that is inherent in the code that's actualized upon execution. It is what the programmer programs the object to be. Through testing, the player can get a better understanding of the coded object. And it is through affordances that we test. So we define affordances along the lines of Don Norman as a relationship between the player, in this case, and the game. It means that properties have nothing to do with affordances per se, because they are inherent in the coded object, but the affordances are what we can do, and it's context dependent. Through this testing, we explore the coded object, and it's also in this case where people, after conducting lots of testing, may be doing theory crafting, because they can say something meaningful about the coded object. On the other hand, we have signification, which we see as something distinct from affordances. Don Norman would say that the signification is important in order to understand what a specific object affords, but we believe it's relevant in so many other cases. Like we had the MedX example, the morphin in Fallout, and that was, of course, what we initially wanted to explore, this procedural or semiotic meaning of the various healing objects. So through perception and through testing, we create a better understanding of the coded object and arrive at an empirical object. That means that the empirical object is subjective, because my previous experience with MedX or morphin may influence how I perceive the in-game object. So we don't have a coded object that is the meaning, and thus this is also a criticism of procedural rhetorics, but the meaning is for us, the players, in the empirical object. This leads us to our synthetic typology. It is, again, three-dimensional and consists of, first off, the complexity of the system, in which we deal with the health paradigm and connected components. So in this dimension, we can explore how one health pack is related to other health packs in the game, and also armor. A simple case would be that of Quake Live, for instance, where you only have a handful of different healing objects that each heal a specific amount, and then you have armor. But you also have more complex cases, as for instance Fallout, where you not only have health, but you also have damage resistance that you can also obtain through objects, and again you have some sort of armor. So the bigger a health system and a health paradigm, and the entire ecology that Hayo talked about before, the more complex the overall system will be. Then we have the complexity of use, which deals both with creation of the health objects, which is relevant for some games, but also the handling. Again, a simple case will be Quake Live, where you don't actually have an inventory, but it's instant pickup of the health pack. And a way more complex case would, the potion per se may not seem that complex, but it is interrelated in a very complex health system, and you have to create it before you can use it. The way you create it is by obtaining both green tea leaves and crystal vial, which you may have to go to various locations, kill enemies in order to obtain. So just the creation of the object is very complex, and then you have the use on top of that, which goes, of course, through the inventory. Then finally, you have the complexity of signification. And here it becomes slightly subjective because, of course, it deals with how you decode specific signs. But you do have some signs that are more concrete and simple than others. Again, in the case of Quake Live, you have the cross that we, in at least Western civilization, associate with some sort of medicine or help. But then if you take the case of the master healing potion, when you create it, you use the green tea leaves that we associate with some sort of healing, and we may even have associations to Asia, where you use it in different contexts maybe than in Denmark, where I'm from. And then you craft from that, through alchemy, a potion that you can use to heal, but it's also a part of a magical universe, and the more complex it is, what we argue here, it's not necessarily that the complexity makes it something different, but that at least it is a way of talking about objects in relation to a typology. So this is very, very fluffy to some extent. And we considered whether we should turn it into something more quantifiable, which we, in order to do that, would have to take a lot of games into consideration, test them through the system, and it would be dependent on a hermeneutic reading of it, of course, as it looks right now. So what can we actually conclude? Well, we can conclude that the full taxonomy did not work for us, and that our different approach to it may be a way of making sense of objects, at least to some extent. It requires analysis, so it's not as simple as just plugging something into a full taxonomy, but I mean, why else would we typologize objects if we did not try to understand them better?
Yeah. And I mean, in the end, what we have basically now as the master question for us for the continuation of that project is if we're actually looking here basically at the two extremes of our own hermeneutic circle in dealing with in-game objects. So if you take the taxonomy and the breakdown of actual occurring health packs in a variety of games as to look at intricate detail, and then our synthetic model as the absolute abstraction, when we actually get the opportunity to do a large-scale analysis of many games in a systematic fashion, then we may actually arrive at, well, a way of refining our synthetic model. That is, so to speak, our next step, and that was it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have a little bit more time for discussion.
I have a comment first. I would like to say that it's fascinating to see that you're employing such structural and formal methods. It's almost as if I was looking into the mirror of myself doing a PhD a few years ago, and I was actually using very structural methods not to understand objects, but I'm familiar with the object ontology project, but to understand player characters. And I did exactly the same. I had a taxonomy, I had tables, I came up with a pivot player character model. I analyzed games on the basis of that, and today I have to say that I'm not sure if I got answer to my questions. So my question to you would be, I'm really super curious how you ended up on that structural, ontological, taxonomical path, and the others, like what's with the pharmacon? It's a really interesting concept that you touched upon, and so I keep my fingers crossed for your structural method, and we have to talk. It was really great.
Well, to answer the first question, it was initially a discussion of semiotic versus procedural meaning of in-game objects, where we found that health packs were extremely interesting. But then we also considered how to actually make meaning of them. And then we discussed, is there anything general we can say about these objects? What do they have in common? And then suddenly that kind of became the mission, to see if we could find anything they had in common, and if it would then make sense to have this structuralistic approach to it, which we're still not quite sure it does. I mean, we have suggested a different model now, the synthetic typology, but there's no doubt that it's very fluffy and so dependent on analysis that you don't use it as you use a full taxonomy, right?
Yeah. I mean, that basically...
How do you dissect meaning from when you test it, when you say, okay, it seems to work, we have this taxonomy, we have this model, things make sense, what happens then?
The taxonomy basically was the step that we took to overcome the shortcomings that we perceive in procedural rhetorics per se. But, sometimes it feels like we're rediscussing the whole ludology versus narratology debate in different terms. And it's again back to, okay, what is more important? Is it the mechanics or is it the signification? And then we talk about them again in isolation. Everyone says, okay, it is important to look at them in conjunction, but then in the end, we usually end up not doing that. So that was our way of trying to break the system apart and see in how many ways can they actually interact. And then from that, try to determine where exactly do we have interesting overlap between those two domains, and how can we then read how, for example, in Fallout, an object behaves in a certain controversial way, and if we have ludonarrative dissonances or consonances in parts. So to unpack that concept as well, to see more precisely where it actually resides. So to answer your second question about the pharmacon, that is exactly then where we are trying to go again with a reading, for example, of Half-Life, as well as Fallout. To make it very simple, no, I can't make it simple. So the question to us is simply, the pharmacon has been of course, a master trope of, if you will, pharmacology. It has been applied to cultural objects, of course, since Plato and Derrida highlighted that. And what we were just asking ourselves is, if I have an in-game object that behaves in a certain way and that I can abuse in the game, and I have an in-game object that at the same time is something like morphine, where the semiotic dimension points me to a history of abuse. How does that gel or not gel? So can I have something in a game that is at the same time a pharmacon and isn't a pharmacon, is trivialized on the one hand and is highly problematized on the other hand, or not? So that is basically what we're trying to do, and that's why we still believe that taxonomy is actually important, but always just as an intermediary step.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. If I'm correct, then there is one thing that all these health packs and systems have in common. That's a quantification of health. Health as a number that goes from 1 to 100. And interesting. What I find interesting in this observation is that this comes. I mean, medicine always has some aspect of measuring fever and so on. But health is a qualitative. Deeply qualitative experience, and but we are getting this kind of quantification back in the form of quantified self-movement, and all these people who measure themselves with trackers and pulses and so on. So we are getting something from inside the game realm into outside the game realm, which comes back in a curious way, and I think that's an interesting aspect of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was more of a comment, but I mean, we are of that tracking species, and I mean, it is basically if you ask yourself, what is the difference between my Pip-Boy in Fallout and my smartwatch? Of course, again, there we have that. Of course, there we have that kind of hermeneutic circle, if you will, between the game and how we actually perceive ourselves, how we quantify ourselves, and it would be a very interesting question, completely out of our scope. How much basically we could track back the whole self-monitoring movement to Dungeons and Dragons and the quantified avatar, if you will. So,
We have time for a very short question.
Yes, thank you for this very exciting talk. As you had the white chamber in there too and everything like this, I wondered if you also have these situations also how to say it, approached where you need another player to heal you, like in multiplayer games or...
In DayZ, you can heal in various ways. Again, it's one of those complex systems where you need food to stay alive, you need drinks to stay alive. But if you've been wounded, you can obtain a blood bag and a needle and another player, and then you can conduct a blood transfusion. But then you need that other player, and it's the most efficient kind of healing, but it's not the only way of doing it.
Because there are also graduations in Call of Duty, for example, there's this survival mode where you only have to press X and you see a bar growing, and that's it for healing, you know. So it's
And
very
of course you have the
interesting.
traditional healers in MMOs, but we decided to exclude that and only focus on the objects because otherwise, again, it would be so broad.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.